Hi, everyone. This is Rob Gray from ASU and the Perception and Action podcast, back with another article review. In today's episode, what I want to look at is adding variability to practice. Of course, a very well studied and talked about thing. I want to look at a new study that has kind of addressed this, looking at kind of how you should add variability to practice and kind of what matters, how it is structured, and the amount of variability you use. So when we talk about, and this is the paper, exact paper, null effects of different amounts of task variation in both contextual interference and differential learning paradigms, recently published in Perceptual and Motor Skills. So when we talk about variability to practice, right, there is, as I said, it's a very well-studied thing, and I've created this resource page on my website, perceptionaction.com/VP for variability to practice, where I've tried to outline all the definitions of, blocked practice versus random practice, constant versus variable practice, and how they fit with the two different approaches to skill acquisition, right? And this is quite confusing at times. So, if you're interested in this area, I would hope you might want to check it out. There's also links to resources and things like that to kind of get the definitions down, because it's very often confused, and that's the case in this paper as well a little bit. So what I want to do here is to start with kind of the traditional way of looking at variability of practice, right? And the classic studies looking at blocked versus random practice, right? So it's important to as I said, definitions are important here. Typically, when we're talking about blocked versus random practice, we're talking about between skill variability. What constitutes a different skill is, of course, for debate. So as example, I like to use is tennis, right? If we think of serving forehands and backhands as different skills within tennis, right? Block practice would be doing a whole bunch of serves, then a whole bunch of forehands, then a whole bunch of backhands. Whereas random practice would be doing one serve, two forehands, one backhand, two, mixing them all up, right? And as I've discussed on this podcast before, and you can find on that resource page, the classic explanation for why random practice, mixing in skills, helps is the contextual interference effect, right? The idea that when you switch between skills, they're interfering with each other. In particular, contextual interference is an information processing idea, right? It's the idea that we're interfering with the development of the motor programs, which are going to control our actions, right? And there's two different kind of explanations that people have put forward that for why contextual interference helps learning. And that is that one is that you have to keep reconstructing the motor program as you switch between skills. The other one is it helps you elaborate, right? As you switch between skills, you're learning more about your movements, because you're getting to compare and contrast what a backhand and a forehand is in tennis, for example. So either this kind of forgetting reconstruction explanation or elaborating on the motor program. And the basic finding that that we find in this random versus blocked domain is that acquisition is slower in random practice. So usually, you learn the skill slower, you perform worse during the acquisition trials. But in the long run, in long-term retention, and particularly in transfer conditions, right? So if we train you on a hard court and move you to a clay court in tennis, we would expect random practice group to be much more effective, right? Because they've developed more adaptable skill. Right? And that's the more elaborate motor program, right? So that's the idea. More adjustable skill is the terminology I would like to use if we're talking about information processing perspective, okay? So within this, also, I should point out there's a kind of an intermediate between blocked and random called serial practice, right? Serial practice is when you kind of have randomness, but it's more structured, right? So you do a serve, a backhand, a forehand, a serve, a backhand, a forehand, right? So you're not doing the same skill on every trial, but there still is some structure to the variability, some sequencing to it. So the other point, the other side of the coin, right, which, as I said, people often mix up in studies, is within skill variability. This is when you're practicing the same skill, like chipping in golf, right? But you're varying the conditions of practice under which you're executing it. So constant practice, it would be doing like 20 chip shots from the same spot on a fairway with a flat ground, okay? Variable practice would be doing a chip shot on flat ground, then downhill, then uphill, then downhill, flat ground, and so on, right? So varying the conditions, not changing the skill. And research has shown that Variable practice is also beneficial for a lot of the same reasons. In terms of the information processing idea, it helps you to parameterize your motor program better, right? So that's within skill variability. The other type of way we can look at the role of variability in practice is, of course, differential learning, right? A very, very different view. And as is the case with variability of practice, I created a resource page for this. You can find that perceptionaction.com/DL for differential learning. In differential learning, we're not trying to elaborate on a motor program. There is no motor program, right? This is a self-organization view of skill. I lump it under the ecological approach. What we're trying to do is create variability in practice to invoke stochastic resonance, right? To interact with the fluctuations in the athlete's own movement to pull out a performance. There's also, right, we want to try to do what we're trying to do in differential learning is we're not trying to get the athlete to perform the skill in the way they would in competition always. What we're trying to do is get them to learn about the solution space by pushing them to do movements they would probably never do in actual competition, right? You know, the famous one I always like to cite is speed skating. They had people do a pirouette before they started, but you're never, ever going to see at the Olympics, right? But the idea here is if we push you into the four corners of solution space, right? In this case, I'm showing it, you know, for example, a shoulder and elbow angle in volleyball. What it's going to allow you to do is find interpolated solutions. So solutions in the middle, right? When you encounter conditions or constraints in a competition that you've never seen before, you can find the solution that will work because you have better knowledge of the solution space, right? So that's one of the goals of differential learning as well. So in this study, and I'll come to this at the end, this study, one of the kind of the weaknesses for me is it's not really driven by any kind of theoretical approach to skill, right? It's just a random kind of a weird mix of conditions that were compared, but I'll get to that later. What they did in this study was they compared a randomized practice schedule that had some kind of structure to it to with a direct learning. They used two different types of direct learning, and they compared that to a condition in which people had very regular structure, right? So what they're essentially doing is using differential learning and serial practice, and what they thought was having some structure to this would be better than just purely random practice, right? So that's kind of the idea they were testing. So basically, they're testing how much variability helps learning, what structure should we have to it, right? So those are kind of the basic overall questions. How should you structure variability in practice? So what they did was they took 42 PE students, right? So these are adults learning to putt on a flat surface, right? They did 10 putts from 3 meters as pre and post tests. They did retention tests. I can't remember so many weeks after. The most interesting part for me was they actually did a transfer test of what they did was put people on putting greens that had thicker carpet, so the ball ran slower, right? So we're changing the constraints there, and you have to adapt to it. Okay, so that was the basic design. There was 8 training sessions over a period of 4 weeks. Okay, and the participants were randomly split into 4 groups: a contextual interference group, a differential learning group, what they call the differential learning plus group, and a constant practice group. Right. So let's go into what these were about. The contextual interference group, they putt from 4 different distances. Right. So even though in the paper they talk about block practice, we're talking about variable practice here, right? Because they're doing the same skill putting, we're varying the conditions. So they putt ranging from 1.2 meters to almost 5 meters. What they did was use a schedule of practice that had kind of randomization, but some structure to it, right? So it started out very blocked, very constant practice. So 9 putts from one distance, 9 putts from another distance, 9 from another. Then they did more of a serial structure where you did 3 from one, then 3 from another, and 3 from another. And then in the last couple of weeks of training, they did a purely random. They progressed you. So they're doing kind of a serial approach where you start with more kind of blocked, less random practice. And as you progress, you make it more random. And research has shown that this can be effective, especially for new learners and young athletes. So that was one of the conditions. The contextual interference was essentially a serial practice condition. The second one was the differential learning. They used the classic kind of differential learning approach where you, from putt to putt, something's changing every execution. whether it's the ball that you're putting, the distance, the standing position, the positions of your head and trunk, the rhythm, and so on, right? So, for example, the participants might be asked to put the ball behind their, back in their stance, in the middle of the stance, forward, have their knees stiff, have their knees bent, and so on, right? And for this, there was no corrective feedback, or you're not repeating the movement at all. You're doing something different on every putt. So, classic differential learning approach. They then had a third condition they called differential learning plus, which I'll get to in a second. I'm not sure what exactly this was trying to achieve, but they had people putting all the same things in the differential learning condition, so change in ball position, body posture, etc. Plus, they also varied the putter you used. Okay, and then the final group they called CP was the control group. They did all the same sessions, except they always putted from the same 3-meter distance every time, right? So they didn't vary the putting distance or any of the other things the group experienced. So they had true constant practice if we're using those definitions. Okay, so what did they find? Not much, right? As the paper, you maybe saw the title of the paper when I showed it, they're null results largely, right? So the only significant difference in terms of the number of successful putts made was in the first retention interval, which I think was like a week after training, where the control group was worse than all the other groups. So kind of a basic finding, maybe we can pull out that variability of practice helps. In some over a constant practice. Variable practice is better than constant practice, which is a classic finding. In terms of the transfer conditions, sort of the same thing. They did 3 different transfer tests, and what they found was the only significant difference was in the second transfer test, the control group was again worse than the variable practice groups, right? So all 3 of them. And importantly, there was no significant difference between the contextual interference, the differential learning, and the differential learning plus groups for any measure in any of the experiment, right? So from this, the authors conclude that what we're seeing here is that adding variability to practice seems to help, right? No matter which way you do it, whether it's in serial structure, differential learning, or this differential learning plus, there is some evidence, in certain conditions, retention and that one transfer condition, that it's better than constant practice, right? Which is consistent with previous research. What their work is suggesting is that the structure and the amount of variability doesn't seem to matter, however, right? So it doesn't matter whether you do a serial practice structure or a differential learning where you're changing on every trial, right? So what they kind of conclude is the effort that you go through in differential learning, where you're changing every trial and you're doing all these wacky things where you're changing posture, may not be worth it, especially for new learners, right? Because it doesn't seem to be adding much. It also doesn't seem to be hurting anything, right? They're not worse, but it doesn't seem to be adding much at all to the actual benefits of training with variable practice. Right. So overall, I think this is an interesting study. It's interesting comparisons of conditions. Looking at the structure of variability and how we should structure it is a really important question that needs more work beyond the traditional blocked versus random dichotomy. But for me, there's some kind of issues within this. Again, they're kind of mixing up I didn't really highlight this, but in the paper, the between and within skill variations, right? This is constant versus variable practice because we're practicing the same skill putting. It's not blocked versus random, right? That's mixing skills, right? You'll find throughout the literature, those 2 things are mixed all the time. So I don't really know if it has much meaning anymore, but I like to keep it going. Kind of one of the issues with this paper, though, is kind of the first thing is the lack of the replication of the classical effect. So the classical effect that when you do constant practice versus variable practice, constant practice leads to faster acquisition, right? So if I'm going to be tested at 3 meters and I'm putting at 3 meters, I should see some benefit in the acquisition phase and the early retention for constant practice, and that's typically what you find in most classic and most constant versus variable and random versus block studies. You get better, faster acquisition when you use a blocked or constant conditions, right? That was not really shown in the study, right? There was no difference between acquisition in all the groups, which makes you wonder, what's going on here that you didn't replicate that. But the biggest problem for me is the lack of the clear theory to guide the design of this study and the interpretation of it, right? The conditions, right, were the first condition, the contextual interference, is a very weird mix of serial practice. It's not, they seem very kind of random choice of what was put in the conditions, not guided by any theory, right? Um, Also, so what was going on there, right? Also, the differential learning plus, right? I'm not sure what that means, right? Adding a variation club, is just another way to do differential learning. It's just another thing you can vary, so it's still just differential learning to me, right? It's just a different type of it. And with that being said, it's important to point out that when you do serial practice, that could be interpreted as a very low level of differential learning, right? As well, right? So, to me, I would have liked to have seen this paper. Here's like what I did at the start. Contextual interference predicts your elaboration of motor program. What do we expect from that, right? Differential learning predicts adaptability and elaboration, right? Stochastic resonance. What do we predict from that? Use that to guide the design of the test conditions and the practice conditions. I think would have come out. Would have come out. I don't think we come out with this with much more understanding of these two different approaches to assigning variability in practice, other than consistent with some of the earlier other work. When you have a very novice performer that's just starting, you probably don't need a lot of variability, right? Because their inherent variability is quite high. So adding, you probably don't need a lot to get a benefit, right? It's probably all going to be very similar. I think that's consistent with what was found in this study. So a very interesting paper, and I like to see, again, more and more of these studies comparing and contrasting different approaches. Again, better if you have the guided by the actual theory itself. All right, so that's it for today's episode. Thank you very much for watching. If you're interested in learning more about the podcast and me, please go to perceptionaction.com. If you're interested in supporting the podcast, which would be a great help to me, which can involve getting transcripts or actually having one-on-one consulting with me, please go to patreon.com/perceptionaction. Thanks, and cheers for now.